Hello, and welcome to Watercolor Painting with Bamboo Brushes. This is an introductory class, and we are going to be using some bamboo brushes, some watercolor paints, and a couple different kinds of paper. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to wake up my brushes. Now, I have a small collection of brushes here, but I'm going to predominantly use the brush that was also in your kit. It's this small, soft bamboo brush. Now, when you first unpack your brush, there's going to be a plastic tip on it. You're going to pull that off, and you're going to put it in some water. Give it a few minutes, and then start swirling it in the water, and gently kind of push it against the side of the cup. That will start to break down the glue that's holding those bristles stiff, and will soften the brush and wake it up for you. You're also going to wake up your watercolors. We have this dot card here, and a dot card is made by just taking a dot of liquid watercolor. I bought some very high quality watercolors for us. I bought some Holbeins. They're my favorite, super densely pigmented, beautiful quality. And you just apply those to a card and then let it dry. This is a really great way to actually make a watercolor set that is very mobile. You can literally put it in like your wallet if you wanted to. But in this case, it was a nice way to split up really high quality watercolors affordably, so we can put them all in these kits for you. So you're going to put a couple drops on water on each dot. That will start to soften it. And once it's soft, you can add a little more water in your paintbrush and start kind of working it with that watercolor to create a pool of color that you can paint with. Now I'm going to put a placemat down for me. Essentially, it's just a spare piece of paper. It's nice because I can use that to dab my brush, to test any strokes out as I go. And right now I'm going to right away start by just swatching my colors. So this first color we have is called Hooker's Green. It's a relatively modern pigment, but it's just a really nice, rich kind of plant green that I like a lot. This one is Indigo. Indigo is a very traditional plant-based blue, very ancient, very traditional to Japanese painting, which I thought would be valuable to us today. Our black is called Lamp Black. It is made using creosote or soot, which is actually the traditional pigment used in traditional Asian inks as well, so I thought that was nice and consistent. And our red is called Carmine, and Carmine comes from crushed bugs, actually. It's a pigment that's been around for ages and ages and ages and is still used contemporarily, and it just has a really nice kind of a rich pinky red that I thought would be good for any kind of florals or other plants that we're working on. Now I want to show you how to double load your brush. Obviously, to load your brush, you just soak it up and you got some color on it and you're ready to go. But you can also double load your brush. So I just loaded it up with red and then just brushed the tip against the paper to clean up it a bit. And then I dipped the tip back into the black. Now I have two colors on my brush, and you can see when I paint down with the side of the brush like that, I actually get two colors in one, black on one side and red on the other. Depending on how thoroughly you do this, you can end up with a really nice gradient. Now the two kinds of paper we have in your kit are we have a Western watercolor paper, which is the thicker paper, and we have a thinner Eastern paper, often called a rice paper. This is actually made out of, I believe cellulose and mulberry is the mix. It's considered like a practice rice paper, so it's not super skinny and super thin, a little more durable. I thought it would work better for us today. Now I'm going to double load my brush, and we're going to start by painting some bamboo. I'm painting on the rice paper, and to paint bamboo I start by doing just 3 strokes, a little bit of separation between each strokes, and I'm using the side of my brush. I'm going to do another stalk right here, just using the side of my brush. The biggest management here is water management. If it's too wet, as soon as I paint down, and you can actually see this in the bamboo stalk on the left, it starts to bleed quite a bit. Even in these little dots I'm putting on the knuckles, which is the next step that I do in bamboo painting. The first 2 are very wet, so they move a little bit, and then there's a little bit less water, so it's a little bit more steady on the other strokes. Now I've tried to really get rid of a lot of my water because I'm just going to do these very fine lines that are going to be the stems kind of coming from the knuckles of the bamboo. And you can see I'm holding my brush very far back towards the end of the brush, and I'm just swinging it very loosely with my wrist to make these long skinny lines. I want to barely touch the surface of the paper. And that's why I did some practice strokes on the right there first. As you're practicing your brush handling skills, you may find yourself making some unintentional marks or marks that you're not super happy with it. That's fine. What I want you to do is actually try and work those marks into your painting. This is supposed to be a pretty meditative, expressive form of painting, and so having a few mistakes and playing around with them actually I think will be to your benefit. So don't worry if your line isn't super straight or super crisp to begin with. Just let it be what it is and keep trying to incorporate it into your work, and you might be surprised with how nice the results become. Now I'm going to add in my leaves, and to do the leaves you actually alternate the amount of pressure you put on your brush. So you start by a very light pressure, so you have that point on the end, and then you push down mid-stroke in order to create a thicker section, and then you lift up again at the end to create either the stem or the point of the brush, or the point of the leaf, depending on where you start your stroke. Bamboo brush painting is all about brush handling and water management. But with brush handling, the best thing you can do is practice your strokes. So you don't have to necessarily dive right into your paper that you have in your kit. Get a piece of printer paper, get some scrap paper, just play around with your brush strokes at first. See how you can create these strokes, these long skinny strokes, these broad strokes, these leaf strokes. Work on your brush handling, and then the rest of the painting is going to become a lot easier. Now, bamboo is an excellent warm-up painting and close-down painting. Bamboo is lovely, and I usually do it at the beginning and the end because it's very straightforward, it's very quick, I know how to do it. My favorite kind of painting, however, is a plum branch or a plum blossom painting. This is another extremely traditional motif, and it is just so much fun to do. The first part is to actually just make the base of the branch. I'm using a Western watercolor paper here just because that's what I wanted to try. And what I'm doing is just loading up my brush. I'm really just slopping it onto the page. And then if you look at my hand, I'm actually twisting the brush as I paint. In twisting the brush, I'm going to actually create these interesting shapes, these interesting bends, these interesting splits. Because of the quality of the bamboo brush, the way that the bristles are constructed, the way that it moves, it can hold on to a lot of water, so you can do a nice long stroke. And then the stroke tends to have a lot of character. You know, you might have some weird, interesting split edges, you have some interesting thin spots and some thicker spots. And a plum branch painting really takes advantage of this. So I started out with just those long branch strokes, and now I'm going to add in the shorter twigs, the shorter kind of stubby sections. Plum branches in particular are really wild. It's a real raggedy kind of gnarly tree. I don't always go specifically for a plum branch. I'm actually more just inspired by these really raggedy, funky trees. So I don't spend as much time actually studying plant anatomy as maybe I would if I were a botanical illustrator. For me, this painting process is very meditative. It's very personal. I'm focused on creating something that's beautiful and inspired by these traditional paintings, but not necessarily copying them. So I'm just adding in branches and a little bit of shading. You can see I dropped in some black there, and then I added a little water over the top to pull through to blend it out. But no matter what I'm doing, I'm trying to be very limited in the number of brush strokes that I use. I already talked about this a little bit just a moment ago, but as you make marks, you might end up making some marks that you don't love or whatever. That's okay. Try not to fuss about them. Try not to overwork anything. I'm not going to try and put, 10 minutes into making one tiny little flower. In this case, I want to sort of use the qualities of the brush, the qualities of the watercolor, and a fairly quick hand in order to create these expressive, emotive strokes. There are a lot of different kinds of painting. You can be very precise, you can be super detail oriented and super realistic. I personally like to use bamboo brushes in this painting technique for something that's a little bit looser, a little bit more open, and a little bit more expressive. I pretty much always work from my imagination. Every once in a while I'll have a photo reference. But for like these trees, for me, they're all just trees that I've dreamt up. I add color in based on kind of how I want things to balance. I just did some leaf strokes, just little strokes with the tip of my brush, and now I decided to do some broader strokes of green, and I'll add a little more definition in there around it. But it was feeling like the branch was a little bare. I wanted it to look a little bit fuller, a little bit leafier, not kind of your traditional gnarly scraggly plum branch, but a little more open, a little bit more summery. And so I'm just going in and adding little strokes of green, which I think is going to provide a better impression of fuller foliage. Now, once I have those green strokes in, I'm going to dab some of the water off my brush so I have a drier brush, and I am actually just going to add in some darker textures to go on top of that branch. This is where I start to deviate from traditional Eastern painting and head into more like a Western watercolor technique. As I said before, Eastern painting uses ink traditionally. Ink behaves differently from watercolor. Ink goes down a little bit differently. It doesn't reactivate as much when you add watercolor to it. So what I'm doing here is really a hybrid practice. I'm inspired by Eastern painting. I'm using an Eastern style brush, but I'm using more, I think, Western techniques to layer some colors on top of each other. Like I'm going to drop in a little bit more blue now. Traditionally, in a plum branch painting, you would kind of just make the strokes of the branch and not add a whole ton of detailing to it. You would kind of just let it be. In this case, I felt like it needed a little more shadow, so I dropped in a few more layers, and it's really up to you as far as how much you want to do of a more Western style or how much you want to do of a more Eastern style. It's your painting, your choice. This should be a relaxing process and a process that fits your aesthetics, so your choice is completely valid, whatever that is. For comparison, I wanted to show you a painting I did earlier. It's got more colors in it. I used my broader resource of watercolors, but this same technique I used can be used to make just tree paintings. It's literally just a difference of is it more horizontal or more vertical. So you can go ahead and take this and create more work in a different subject matter if you want. Now this next painting that we're going to do is just of apples, and I like painting various fruits and fruit trees. I like the contrast of kind of close up on a particular subject. In this case, it's a fruit, and then the kind of texture and foliage of the tree in the background. Usually I'm actually more of a figural artist. I do a lot of work with the human figure and the face, so I find this technique using these bamboo brushes is actually really rewarding because I don't find myself as drawn to doing human figures. I find myself drawn to the natural world and to plants and to landscapes, and so it allows me to tap into different subject matter and really engage with it in a different way. That's just my personal experience. You can see I'm using some different brushes. I decided to just show off what some of these other brushes can do. I really love this particular brush that I have. It's very long, very flexible, and so I can make these really lovely long strokes. And again, I'm doing a stylized sort of apple tree was what I wanted to do here. So the first thing I'm doing is doing these long strokes next to each other to create an impression of bark without making a completely solid tree. Obviously I'm working in blue. I just thought that would look nice. It's not super natural, but that's okay. Now I'm trying to let each stroke speak for itself. I will occasionally put two strokes next to each other to fill one up or to add a little bit more color to it. But like I said before, it's sort of a hybrid between traditional Eastern and Western painting. So I'm letting each brush stroke really speak for itself, but I am curating them a little bit by adding in, some edging. I'm just going to add in some leaf strokes with some green, and then I will actually set this painting aside and we will come back to it at the end of the video after I've let it dry. Depending on what sort of Eastern technique you're doing, whether it's more Japanese or more Chinese or more Korean or more Zen, you may paint everything all at once. You may not go back at all. Or you may do multiple layers, let one layer dry. I would say in Western painting, it's more traditional to paint, let it dry, and then add another layer. Let it dry, add another layer. And so I'm going to do that at least with that painting, that apple painting. We'll come back to it in a little bit. I don't actually do that a ton with my watercolors in my personal practice. I prefer to be fairly spontaneous and work all in one go. But I thought it would be nice for this video to at least show kind of how I would approach that. If that is your preference, you can try that too. Now for this real quick little painting, I'm just going to do a little landscape. I just wanted to show a landscape, but I'm also showing something else here. I'm actually painting on printer paper. So it's just a cheap copy paper that I have here. And what I want to show is that you absolutely can practice on copy paper. Sometimes people get really caught up on what paper do I buy, what do I use? And you can practice on anything. But the quality of your strokes and the way that the paint goes down is going to vary wildly depending on if the paper is more absorbent, can hold on to more water, or if it's thinner or rejects water and just doesn't want to quite hold on to it. In this case, you can see the watercolor comes out looking kind of speckled. And what that actually is that there's parts of the paper that soak up more water than others. It's not evenly sized. It's not evenly produced. So I will sometimes go on printer paper just for practice, to practice my strokes, to practice techniques, to practice ideas, but I wouldn't suggest using it for anything that you want to kind of hang up or keep as a permanent painting. But that said, there's no need to be super, ritzy and exclusive about what kind of materials you use. Use what you have on hand. Practice with whatever you've got. In this case, I wanted to make a really soft, slightly foggy mountain painting, and working on printer paper was perfect for that. Now I know we're whipping our way through a bunch of different paintings. One thing I would say with this kind of medium is that I do tend to paint quite a few paintings in a sitting, as opposed to spending forever on just one. I will do a series of them. You maybe let one dry and come back and add some details to it later. In this case, I wanted to try something new with you all. I've never actually done a painting quite like this, but I was looking at some examples of fruit paintings and grape paintings and berry paintings in particular, and I thought those look really beautiful, and I think will look really nice with the indigo. So what I'm doing is just loading up my brush, and I'm making sure there's not too much water, and then I'm tapping it against the page, giving it a little twist, and then adding in a few little strokes on top. What I'm trying to do is create an incomplete circle so that there's this little kind of light section on top. That's going to be the light reflection. So instead of painting in white like I might with an acrylic, I'm letting just the white of the paper remain to create a shine on the grape. And I gotta say, I'm really pleased with how it came out. I think it's beautiful. Then I'm going to go straight into the green, and I'm just going to use pure green here. I really like the bright contrast. That Hooker's green is quite bright compared to like the softer, slightly more organic blue of the indigo. And I'm really taking advantage of the brush here. It's split a little bit, and I kind of love that. It's going to give me some funkier edges, and I can use just the tiny little split edge of the brush, barely touches the page, and get these extremely fine lines. That contrast I think is really nice. You know, I have these bolder splotches for the grapes. I have these broader strokes for the leaves, and then these tiny little lines for the various stems and whatnot. That mix in stroke style is what's going to make a painting interesting. If it's all the same thickness and intensity of stroke, you're going to have not as much visual interest in what you do. Remember that your bamboo brush here is your strongest asset while you're painting. It has a different, more dynamic, more expressive quality than a lot of traditional Western brushes. So if it splits, if it adds a lot of texture, if it gets a little dry, play around with that and see how that can actually add more visual interest to your painting. Now we're going to go back in and add a few more details to this apple painting. I actually had it off to the side and let it dry for probably around 20 minutes. I could have let it dry more, but this will work just fine for me. And you can see I'm actually working a lot of color into my brush, and then I'm dabbing it to dry it out. I do not want a very wet brush, because what I'm trying to do here is just add in some precise details and some outlines. Now, outlines don't exist so much in nature, but I find adding outlines can help add definition to the painting itself. And this, I think it adds another level, another layer of interest, a little bit more contrast, and the light and the dark. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Now, the one thing I actually regret a little bit is I'm going to put just a little bit of blue in here for a shadow. And it's not bad, but this is something that just comes with practice. I don't do a whole ton of these apple paintings specifically, and I haven't worked with this color palette a whole ton. So what I realized afterwards, it's fine. I think it kind of muddies it up. And so if I went back, I'd probably just keep the red. The last new painting I'm going to show you is a simple little morning glory painting. Now I'm going to take advantage of the amount of water on my brush to create either a closed morning glory or an open one, a wilted one, or a blossom. So these first two that I'm going to paint, I consider these more slightly wilted ones. I wanted to show morning glories at all stages of their developments. So these, you can see it's actually not as much water, so it's a little bit tighter, a little scragglier. These next ones that I'm doing more water, which means that they open up a little bit wider. You end up having these softer connections between the petals, and if you know what a morning glory looks like, it actually has these soft, almost like web-like connections between its petals. So the amount of water causes the pigment to spread out more or less. And so in a healthier, like younger blossom, that extra water spreads it out and creates a more naturalistic petal. Then I'm going to go through and add in some green details. So I have that one blossom up top, I have the two wilted ones in the middle, and then I have the fresh ones down at the bottom. I'm adding in this pure green because it's, again, a nice bright contrast to that blue, just like we saw in the grape painting. But I think I'm going to actually add in just one more extra color with this one. So the morning glories that I have in my house, or in my garden, have some purple to it. So we have this nice carmine red. So in just a moment here, I'm actually going to dip into that red, but I'm not going to do any real strokes. What I'm just going to do is dab a little red right into each of these petals. And we won't see much right away, but that red will start to push out against that indigo pigment and will start to blend with it. And hopefully we should see just sort of a glowy hint of purple when it dries. While I wait for that morning glory painting to dry, I'm going to do one last painting of bamboo. Like I mentioned earlier, I will often start and end any bamboo brush painting session painting bamboo. It feels kind of appropriate based on the materials that I'm using. I'm going to be very careful right now to try and keep this as minimalist as possible. I think sometimes with this style of painting, I can be very maximalist and I can overdo it. You know, I just don't let each of the brush strokes breathe. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You know, these brushes are so expressive, they're so dynamic. The brush itself is really a work of art, and the way that it behaves contributes to the quality of the painting. So right now, I'm just going to do the simplest little bamboo thing I can. Just 3 bunches of leaves, a little stem on the bottom, and even then this is still a little bit more complicated than it necessarily needs to be. But for me, this is quite a simple painting and felt like an appropriate way to end my painting session. To close out this video, I'm just going to show these 3 paintings. We've got the Morning Glories, the Bamboo, and the Grapes. They all use the same mix of colors, and so I thought it'd be nice to see these different ways that you can use the same materials to create very different subjects. You can see that the grapes have completely dried. Some more interesting details have shown up. You'll find that when it dries, you may actually have it change a little bit, so make sure to let it dry and then assess it and see if you need to do any last finishing details. Thank you so much for painting with me today. I hope we get a chance to do some more art in the future, and I hope you make some masterpieces. If you want to share them with me, I am on Instagram at eholtart, and I would absolutely love to see what you do.